In 1933, 6 years before the outbreak of World War II, the German meta-historian Oswald Spengler published a book called The Hour of Decision. This book was a polemical successor to his more even-handed magnum opus, The Decline of the West. Spengler's Hour of Decision was intended to crystallize and declare in no uncertain terms where the West was headed. The Western world, the West as a civilization, the West as a complex of nations and cultures and historic flesh and blood peoples was facing an imminent state of emergency. The West was plunging headlong into a century of decline, and very few people were able to see beyond the horizon of their own hubris. Drunk on self-adulation and a view of history that supposed their own achievements as a civilization were simply inevitable, Western leaders and ideologues were unable to see the precipice on which all their nations stood. Something dark was brewing, and in terms explicit and prophetic, Spengler warned that our final days were at hand. What was the nature of this coming crisis, reverberating beneath the surface, preparing to unleash itself on one of the greatest civilizations in world history? Spengler is known for his cyclical view of civilizations, organically structured with an analogy of seasons. The spring of a culture is characterized by a youthfulness, saturated with romance, with myth, with heroism, with dynamic impulses that are driven by creativity and faith in destiny and in God. In the Western case, the Christian God. In time, the flowers reach their bloom. Culture achieves its fullest and most profound heights. This is the summer of a culture, with all the myths and romances of springtime infusing themselves deep into the lifeblood of a people. The hard work and diligence of a youthful civilization mature into a certain robustness and self-confidence that allows a civilization to defend itself from all that threatens it, to expand its foundation to new frontiers, and to spread its civilization out into the darkness that exists in the world beyond. But summer eventually gives way to autumn. By autumn, a civilization has already reached its peak maturity and leaves behind in small steps the dynamism and faith that once grew it. Abandoning its gods, the civilization codifies and rationalizes its way forward. Myths become cold facts. The romance of culture becomes stilted, and that moment of harvesting draws near. The fruit is consumed, culture becomes productized, and the elites begin to betray, at least within themselves, the soul of their civilization. Spengler anticipates the transition from the Western autumn to the coming of winter, the death of the West. If the spring of Western civilization was born around 1000 AD, built on the foundation of the Christianization of Europe, and reached its summer by the time of the Reformation, fall or autumn soon came after it in the form of enlightenment, of rationalism, of the triumph of modern man over the purported delusions of Christian Europe. But winter, warned Spengler, was on the horizon at the beginning of the 20th century. Winter is an epoch of civilizational defeat, of the soulless megalopolis over the romantic countryside. Money replaces tradition. Democracy and human mass replaces aristocracy and nobility. Birth rates fall. The warrior ethic is all but banned. Technology becomes a god, happy to outsource the duties of man to sweat and to bleed for something beyond himself. In a civilization's winter, internal decay becomes the norm. The flowers lose their luster and fruit trees shrivel. The soil hardens. Even the sun is blotted out. Such an internal state of slumber leaves a civilization unwilling, indeed unable, to summon the will to defend itself. It lays prostrate, totally exposed, vulnerable to external forces. The internal death prepares the groundwork for external enemies. This is where civilization lay at the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, the 20th century, billed by the ideologues and the academics and the manufacturers of public opinion as the zenith of human history, was in fact the story of the death of the West. World War II, we can see now from the position of hindsight, was indeed a nail in the coffin for Western civilization. But Spengler did not need World War II to explain the coming winter. Winter was inevitable. World War II was simply a manifestation of this death, not the cause. Civilizational winter caused World War II, and not the reverse. The conclusion of the war marked the beginning of the West's spirit of total liquidation. All our heritage, all our dynamism, all our old artifacts and residues of institutions and standards and achievements and glories were about to enter an epoch of desecration and disappearance. In undergoing such a civilizational transformation, a great rolling back of 1,000 years of brilliant growth and expansion, we made ourselves vulnerable to a revolution against our civilization from forces beyond it. This phenomenon of forces beyond our civilization working from the suicidal and corrupted elite from within our civilization is a theme that comes up often in right-wing or pro-Western literature. Indeed, it is an undercurrent of the prophetic book, The Camp of the Saints. The invasion of the third world, we now understand, is facilitated and politically subsidized by our own leaders. Spengler saw all this as well, describing this 1-2 punch first as germinating as a white world revolution, which is suicidal, and only secondarily as a colored world revolution, which is homicidal. Whites, or those native to European or Western civilization, would first engage in internal crises and reckless deconstruction. This comes in the form of the French Revolution, the 1840s German revolutions, Bolshevism, communism, and democratic mob rule, clamoring for technology, for cultural upheaval, and the collapse of Western tradition and custom. As this happens, the gates are breached, and Westerners are assaulted by those who have no history in our lands. This is the colored revolution, the coming of the third world into our nations, infiltrating our governments, invading our systems, saturating our communities, conflicting with us, mocking us, replacing us, erasing us. What is happening now in America? What is happening in England, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Scandinavia is all part of the same phenomenon. And we are simply the largest zones into which this phenomenon is percolating. The roots of this death are all over the 20th century, especially in the events following the World Wars and the triumph of the American and Soviet empires. Today, we are going to delve into the threat that we face by learning from the experience of Rhodesia. The Rhodesian experience matters because it is a microcosm of our own state of emergency. It happened there before it happened here. And if we want to better understand what is happening here and what must be done, we must see clearly what the post-civilizational world revolution has already done. And with this as an introduction, I'll turn now to my conversation with our guest, Will Tanner. Will Tanner, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Of course. When people are looking into Rhodesia on Twitter, your name often comes up as someone that has read a decent amount about it. So I wanted to have you on, do a little bit of a deep dive and overview of Rhodesia, its history and why it's important, etc. So let's just start off sort of with an easy question. And that is, tell us a little bit about you, and then maybe in particular, why you're interested in Rhodesia. You and I have talked a lot about other stuff like Heritage America and the meaning of the American nation, who the American people are, but Rhodesia seems far away. So why Rhodesia?
Yeah, the joke answer I always give is that I'm from Atlanta, which is true. But we would just always joke about Zimbabwe because it seemed somewhat relevant in the context of the American South. But the real answer is that I got really into Eric Prince and Blackwater when I was in like middle school. I found this book by a guy named Jeremy Scahill. And from what I remember, it was supposed to be a hit piece on how terrible Prince was. But reading it as like a 12-year-old, I thought it just made Prince seem like the coolest guy ever. So I got really into mercenaries and private military contractors from that, which of course leads into Soldier of Fortune and Rhodesia and the Rhodesian experience in war. And what was fascinating to me about it, just as someone who's always been interested in history and military history, is the context of the struggle, where it's this small relatively prosperous and functional state in Africa. At the time the war started, one of the few left. And it's fighting outright communists who admit to being communists and funded by the communists in the Soviet Union and China, which we can get into the split later. But despite doing that, in the midst of the Cold War, it was destroyed primarily because of America and Britain's efforts to do so. And that's something that comes through pretty strongly just through the Soldier of Fortune articles on it I found when I was younger. And I've found that confusing and fascinating, and then met a few other people who had heard about it in college and thought about it a little bit more and talked about it often in the context of the Confederacy. And I just continued to find it interesting. And then when I found Ian Smith's book on it, The Great Betrayal, that really opened my eyes to I guess, the full context and history of Rhodesia's struggle and Rhodesia's fight. And I just happened to have a lot of time to read when I found that one because I was in law school at the time and didn't have much of a social life. So I had a lot of time to read more about Rhodesia and learn more about it. And I just became fascinated by the story of this country that built civilization out of nothing in about a generation. And then within a couple generations from there, it was all destroyed, not because they had done anything wrong or because they were some insane genocidal regime. In fact, they were quite moderate and stable, but purely because they represented the old order and the old way of doing things and refused to change as the world changed. And so pretty much the entire world teamed up to destroy them, which I think is extremely interesting, and it's what drew me to the story.
Yeah, so you've written a couple things on this, and I read those articles before we went live. And one of the things that I picked up when you discuss Rhodesia, you're always setting the backdrop um, by explaining the age of European exploration, because you can't really understand the identity crisis that was going on in the 1970s, 1980s in Rhodesia without understanding its European roots. And one of the things that I like about your contributions to this conversation is the fact that you really set the soil for the whole situation way back in European pride, the European willingness and almost the obligation that they felt to expand their civilization to new horizons. So before we even get to the 20th century, you actually have a lot of thinking that you've done about the role that European civilization played in that sense. And so maybe set the context back there so that we can move forward to the 20th century.
Yeah. So what's really fascinating about Rhodesia is the way that its history just so closely parallels various turning points in Western history. And so it begins as the brainchild of Cecil Rhodes, who made a fortune in the diamond mines and then wanted to expand the empire and uh, do so both from a profit perspective and from imperialist nationalist perspective, which makes him an interesting character on his own. But he saw that Britain was this expanding force and that with the right people in charge and really by bringing excellent men into austere climates to do great things, you didn't need that many people. You could just you could just do things, to use the modern internet parlance. And what makes Rhodes so interesting is that he and perhaps a couple others in the empire over the 19th century saw this. James Brooke was another, but Rhodes was the one at the end. And so Rhodesia flowers out of that, where he says, well, there's this essentially unsettled, open, virgin land to the north of South Africa. The South Africa is being patched together right now. The second Anglo-Boer War hadn't happened yet, so you didn't get the integration of those areas. But there was just this open area to the north, and someone was going to take it. As is noted by pretty much every honest author of the period, the Mashona and the Ndebele were doing a terrible job of running the country on their own. Their rule was largely characterized by enslaving each other and murdering each other and treating their cows better than they treated each other. And so that state of things wasn't going to last. There was no structures there, no roads, no development. And Rhodes just set out to do it and decided that he would be the one who made it happen. He would take the responsibility upon himself. He would take the cost upon himself, and he would do it. And to make that happen, he didn't do the thing you might imagine, like if you read about the attempt to take over Equatorial Guinea in the 1990s or early 2000s, where it's just this collection of rogues that have nothing better to do and want to go on some adventure. No, he was extremely selective in who he put together for the Pioneer Column, which was the armed force that marched north to extend British South Africa Company rule into Rhodesia, or what became Rhodesia. And his selection criteria was he wanted the best men, not necessarily only members of the upper class, though he was looking for those because it brought their parents' capital and their capital into the project, but the middle classes, the working classes. But he wanted men who were well-read, who knew what they were doing, who were competent, had a wide variety of skills, and could be the foundation for an empire of excellence. He was really specific about looking for that. And so that is the milieu out of which Rhodesia comes. It's not just this adventure, though it was very adventurous. And you have Courtney Sellis, who's the background for Alan Quatermain, being deeply involved with the Pioneer Column. It's this small, rugged collection of truly excellent men who wanted to do something great and were spurred towards it by the leading figures of the imperial movement. And it's out of that that Rhodesia's foundation starts, and then some changes that happen in Britain around this period really accentuate that and spur Rhodesia's development, which I can get into next if you want.
Yeah, so I really like that theme because this idea of having this British excellence, and this is something that characterized a lot of Western explorations for hundreds of years. This idea that you can actually do great things and put your mark on history by basically, building out heroic forces that can go and build. And one of the themes I think of the late 20th century after World War II is this total collapse of that willingness to make a mark on history, and everything kind of devolved into this self-hatred. I think that's really what characterizes the European spirit, and even now it's the American spirit as well. The entire Western civilization began to doubt itself. And so by the 50s and 60s, European and Western political and cultural elites more generally, they adopted this spirit of self-hatred and this degradation. So that's part of this story here too, because what Rhodesia was seeing and witnessing was they were being abandoned. They had kept this spirit alive, and yet back in the homeland, in Britain and in America and all over Western Europe, France, etc., the elites were basically betraying that spirit. So this is one thing that you emphasize in your writings, is that to really understand the Rhodesian experience, we have to understand that Rhodesia was actually a holdout in the midst of an overall tendency toward imperial deconstruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're looking at Rhodesia as being formed by the Pioneer Column, one thing you would expect, and that did happen, is that the culture is extremely unique. Like, it's not Kentucky, it's not even Virginia, it's something a little bit different, where you do have these tobacco plantations, cotton plantations, but the sort of people going to them are kind of like latter-day versions of the Cavaliers fleeing to Virginia, where if you look at British tax policy after 1911, when the People's Budget was passed and the Parliament Bill was passed, the tax policy for the successful, wealthy people in Britain was extremely punitive and onerous. By the time of the mid 20th century, you have 90+% death and income taxes, along with just a host of fees, taxes, fines. It made life impossible if you weren't just like a layabout who wanted to be on welfare. And so there were different escape valves for that. Some people fled to Canada, some people fled to South Africa. The kind of dissipated elite that just wanted to drink went to Kenya largely. But Rhodesia, because of its extremely selective immigration policy, which only let in people who it felt would like fully acclimate to the more British than the British, excellence-dominated society that existed in Rhodesia kind of through the early 20th century. It was really that like competent best man of Britain who was tired of dealing with socialism and the labor regime that moved to Rhodesia. So you have, and that was across social classes. Like Ian Smith's parents were like lower middle class to middle class people from Scotland. You famously have the Duke of Westminster selling a lot of property in England to settle estates and plantations in Rhodesia. You have the Duke of Montrose actually moving out of Scotland to Rhodesia because he was just tired of dealing with it all, and he became a leading figure in the Ian Smith government. And the reason I emphasize that is because that was not only the social foundation and scene in Rhodesia, but the sort of people who led it and who characterized it. It was people who wanted to continue building something and build something for their heirs, and do so in a way that wasn't just extractive, but was still informed by these principles of noblesse oblige and tradition that had dominated the society they had to flee. And that clashed extremely strongly with the post-war British government, where if you look at Clement Attlee and the sort of just scum of the earth who composed his government, it was all these bitter, resentful freaks, kind of like the sort we have today, who just wanted to tax everything and destroy everything. They were uninterested in tradition. They were entirely uninterested in greatness or achievement. They just wanted total equality. And that continued for years. And so by the time of Harold Wilson, who's the prime minister for the whole independence struggle, you have a Britain that is led's probably the wrong word, ruled by these just spiteful mutants who hate everything. They hate greatness. They particularly hate the sort of person who embodies greatness. And so in books like J.R.T. Wood's So Far and No Further, or Peter Baxter's Rhodesia, A Complete History, they have these really funny anecdotes of Wilson and people like him having to meet and deal with the Rhodesians. And the Rhodesian side was always these war heroes who had been strapping young men in high school and played sports and were wealthy and accomplished. And then on the British side, it's all these obese bureaucrats who are sniveling and very uncomfortable around men like that. And the British hated dealing with it because they were made so uncomfortable, and it really showed just how far they had degraded. So the World War II thing is important, but I do think it's important to emphasize the social change, even before World War II, that was coming over Britain, and both how it led to Rhodesia's development and how it led to the extreme clash of personalities and worldviews between the Rhodesians and the British.
Yeah, so let's talk about the experiences of Ian Smith then for a moment. So by the time he comes onto the scene, Rhodesia is not independent. It is a colony of Britain. How does it relate to Britain?
Yeah, so it had originally been ruled kind of like Virginia was, or the East India Company, where it's a private company that owns it. That ended in the 20s, and it got local self-rule as part of the Commonwealth, Empire, the Dominions. That form of government changes a good bit over the years. By the 50s, what you get is the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, where it's like Rhodesia, Zambia, and some of the other colonies around there that decided to be in an economic, really, and semi-political federation, because like Zambia has a lot of copper but didn't have many white people. Rhodesia had a lot of white farmers. There were these other territories that could benefit from being in a block with them. And so that's how Rhodesia was structured in the 50s. But it's still a dominion of the crown, and so part of the empire. It wasn't independent yet. That turns into a big clash as decolonization starts, because there aren't really many whites in Zambia. And so Zambia was always just going to go native as soon as kind of the game was up, which was a problem because of the copper belt, but otherwise not a huge deal. The Rhodesians, however, were unwilling to go along with decolonization because they saw what was happening elsewhere. At first, there was the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, where it was just these horrible rebels who would torture farmers and livestock to try and terrorize the government into going along with their schemes for local self-rule. The British government beat them, defeated the insurgency, and then left and handed power to the Mau Maus. And so all the whites had to flee or died. Then you get the Congo. And if you read about the Tonga crisis or the Simba Rebellion, which dominated the Congo from 1960 to about 65, you have all these refugees who are streaming out of this country that had been a jewel of Africa. I mean, the Congo was a place, the Belgian Congo was a place Europeans went on vacation because it was so nice and well developed by the Belgians. And then literally overnight, that all just goes to hell, and they all have to flee, or they're just murdered in the most grisly and horrific ways you can possibly imagine. Like if you read the accounts of the white mercenaries who were hired by the government to try and restore some form of order, it's just horrible. And because of the geographic positioning, all of those refugees who couldn't fly out or flee to French Congo, which was difficult because of the terrain, came into Zambia, and then from Zambia, or at the time Northern Rhodesia, into Southern Rhodesia, which we think of as the Republic of Rhodesia. And the Rhodesians saw that and said, well, yeah, we're not doing this. Obviously not. We don't all want to be murdered by insane rebels. And also, we've never had apartheid. We have a functional society. Why would we all give it all up for nothing, for no reason? And it was out of that fight that Ian Smith and the Rhodesian Front Party formed, where you originally have what was his name? I think Roy Walensky and a few other Rhodesian politicians involved with both Rhodesia itself and the Federation, Sir Garfield Todd, who are something of moderates, and they wanted to strike a deal with the British and thought they'd be able to do so. And it's kind of like the moderate Republicans today, where they just think that if they're like willing to bend on every issue, then eventually something will work out for them. That was a couple members of the political leadership group. Most of the country was not on board with that at all. And so you get the Rhodesian Front form, and it won like every seat in the first election where it was an offering. And Ian Smith wasn't initially the party leader, but pretty quickly became one because he really emphasized Rhodesian virtue, or just embodied it. He had his parents had moved to Rhodesia from Scotland, built a pretty successful farm ranch. He was a Spitfire pilot and hero during the Second World War. There's these dramatic tales of him escaping from the Germans behind enemy lines after his Spitfire was shot down. He was well liked, really sociable, regarded as the like classic gentleman by everyone who met him. So he, of course, did very well in politics and quickly became the leader of the Rhodesian Front. And the Rhodesian Front's main platform was, we're not having majority rule, and we're not giving over all the farmland in the country to the blacks, which we can get into that if you want. But their main platform was just, we don't want to let the British destroy our country in the name of equality, which is what set up the independence battle. Is the British demanded that either they had to give over majority rule in the country just entirely and remain part of the empire, or if they wanted independence and to leave the empire, the condition for the British agreeing to that was majority rule. The slogan was no independence before majority rule, which is what set up the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in '65.
Okay, so he has this book, his memoirs, basically, and in America, as you said, the title is The Great Betrayal, and I think in Europe it's the same book, but it's called The Bitter Harvest. Is that right?
Yeah, The Bitter Harvest was the reprint, and it might have been printed mainly in Europe. It's essentially the same book. It just has a different introduction.
Right. Okay, gotcha. So now did he create the UDI, and whether or not he did that, what was the UDI, and what was he trying to achieve with it?
Yeah, so UDI came out of the Rhodesian Front. I don't think he drafted it. It was really like not a word for word copy, but a very close copy of the American Declaration of Independence. They thought that would help them.
What does that stand for? Do you know?
Oh, it's the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. Yeah, Unilateral Declaration of Independence.
Okay, so with his objective with this basically is to separate from Britain, because Britain is initiating all of these onerous equalitarian measures. Is that right?
Yeah. Sorry, I should have explained that better. So
that's okay. That's what we're doing. That's good.
Yeah, so Britain is demanding majority rule. This reaches a head in 1965, where Rhodesia just wants out because it doesn't want to turn into the Congo. This is kind of as that crisis has come to a head and all the horror stories are coming back. Britain is demanding they institute majority rule, which would just be Congo-style egalitarianism and then chaos. Zambia has gone along with majority rule and has left the Federation and has left the empire, which put this hostile bloc to Rhodesia's north, from which people who had been protesters that were just shut down by the Rhodesian government had fled and turned into this budding terrorist group that was starting to launch, at first, very small scale attacks, but attacks nonetheless into Rhodesia. And so it's out of that situation that the Rhodesians decide, well, we don't care what the British say. They say we need majority rule for legal independence, but we just want to leave. Ian Smith was the party leader at this point. He was also the one handling most of the negotiations. So he gets...
Is this like the 50s, 60s?
Oh, this is 65.
65. Okay.
Yeah. 64 and 65, but really it comes to a head in 1965.
Mhm.
He gets not quite guarantees, but soft agreements with the Portuguese, which at the time Portugal was still ruled by Salazar and controlled Mozambique, which borders Rhodesia and was important because it's a very long land border. And the port of Beira is the only port through which they could import oil, which the Portuguese controlled it, but them being friendly helped a lot. And then he gets another, not guarantee, but agreement with the South Africans who are going to supply Rhodesia with weapons and trade with it and so on if the worst happens. So with that set up and negotiations with the British going nowhere, on November 11th at I think 11:11 a.m., like the armistice, Rhodesia declares independence, and it's just a spit in the eye of the British, who at this point they just despise for being weak and cowardly liars and all that.
Mhm.
And the British are furious that it happens on Armistice Day, and so it's a unilateral declaration of independence, which is important because it means Britain didn't agree to it. And so Britain immediately goes to the UN and starts pushing for sanctions and a crackdown on Rhodesia and all that. Ian Smith had worked with the Rhodesian military before this to ensure there wouldn't be a coup for the benefit of the British. There are reports that Harold Wilson, who's the prime minister at this time and just probably the worst of the socialist British prime ministers, tried to get the SAS to invade Rhodesia and take out Smith, but the SAS refused. That's the rumor. It's probably true.
Mhm.
And the British military was essentially unwilling to be involved. The Royal Navy instituted a nominal blockade of Mozambique, but failed because it didn't want to do it. So you have the British government is extremely hostile to Rhodesia. America is largely going along with that, and the communists are supplying the Rhodesian rebels, which is what sets up the Bush War. And Ian
Mhm.
Smith is the prime minister, is the leader of Rhodesia during this period. And this all
Mhm.
happens at the end of 1965.
What is driving the British here? Is it just pure ideology? Are they just drunk on that, or are they making economic deals with the Soviet Union? What's going on?
It's primarily the egalitarianism thing. As a lot of commenters on the British Empire pointed out, they had to give up a lot of the empire because of the Suez Canal crisis in the 50s. I think that was 56. But they really hastened to give a lot of it up when they didn't need to. Yemen is one classic example of that, but it was really a lot of it. Lee Kuan Yew points to this and kind of describes the situation in his From Third World to First, which picks up around this period. And one thing he points out, and then people like Peter Baxter point out, is the British government was intent on having good relations with the African Commonwealth countries after they had left the empire and gotten local majority self-rule, but wanted to be part of the Commonwealth for trade purposes, which Britain probably needed in the case of like Nigeria because of the oil that it was extracting offshore there. But in most of those cases, it was really just the British didn't want to be yelled at by these African dictators. And so, which they
Mm.
were yelled at anyway, but they went along with it all to try and appease the Africans like Idi Amin and all these just horrible people. And so the Rhodesians pointed out, we actually have a republic. We don't have full mass democracy because we have this kind of property voting system. But, people vote here. They're not just murdered by their government. We don't take their stuff. Why are you supporting these insane dictators over us? And Britain's response was always, well, they believe in equality and we want to trade with them. So we're going to destroy you.
Yeah, this is something that the American right has to deal with a lot as well, because what's happened is with our intellectual class, they are so committed to these ideological lines of thinking, and so are committed to egalitarianism. They are committed to decolonialism. They are committed to basically apologizing and rolling back their progress in the expansion of Western civilization. And so, one of the difficulties when you're dealing with something like that is political realists like Ian Smith, they actually have to deal in the complexities and gray areas of political life. They don't have the luxury of just wishful thinking,
Mhm.
like American and British ideologues at the time and even still today are committed to. And so when you're dealing with these enemy forces that are basically mobilizing and aligning with African dictators, you have to deal carefully with things that are uncomfortable, like the racial dynamics. So maybe talk a little bit about political realism in Ian Smith's head when he's
Mhm.
dealing with these very obvious anti-white, anti-European sentiments that are going on at the grassroots level and being sponsored by Britain and perhaps communism?
Yeah, so I'll describe the Rhodesians' like internal situation first, and then how that plays out in international politics, because I think that helps explain the dynamic a little bit better. Um, and so internally, Rhodesia had never had apartheid. It did have some discriminatory legislation, particularly bans on like selling liquor to Africans. But for one, most of that was meant to be helpful, and two, most of it had been done away with by like the 50s and 60s. Really, what remained were two big things. One was the Land Apportionment Act, which had attempted to allow Africans who wanted to preserve traditional village life, like do so while also not just handing over all the country to them. So about somewhere around half the land was set aside for whites to buy if they wanted to buy it and develop really commercial agriculture farms growing tobacco, raising cattle, sometimes grain or cotton, but tobacco was the big cash crop. A small percentage of the land was set aside for blacks who wanted to buy it and try farming in the same style. That didn't really happen because they didn't want to. And then the remainder of the land, so close to half, but maybe not quite, was in tribal trust land, which is where Africans could just live on villages and do what they wanted. There weren't really many taxes or regulations, which was fine, and they liked that. And it kept the tribal structure and the village chief structure intact, which was important politically, as we'll get into in a minute. But the downside was African farming practices are absolutely horrible for the soils. They were always running out of land to farm. Their soil was always just a disaster fertility wise. And they wouldn't improve their farming practices, nor could they like raise capital against the value of their land because of how it was structured to try and regenerate it. So you have all these issues with the Africans running out of land and an increasing number of them moving into the cities to work. That was then like a political flashpoint, not just because the Africans wanted more land, though they did, but because of how the Rhodesian voting system was set up, where the compromise they decided on, and this took various forms over the years, but the kind of classic formulation that explains it best is the A roll and B roll system, where overall to vote, one had to have a certain amount of property or income in Rhodesia, and or a certain amount of education. And it was a matrix that varied depending on how much you had of each. So if you were highly educated, you had to have some property, but somewhat less, which gave like graduates a better start in the political process. Or if you were like landed and had a relatively large amount of income or property, but had never cared about school, that also wasn't really an issue as long as you could like read and write. And it was administered fairly. There were no accusations that it was just, like counting bubbles on soap, like in the Jim Crow South, allegedly, to keep blacks out from voting. It was pretty fairly administered. And it was administered across races where you just had to meet these qualifications in a non-racial way to be able to vote in the A system. The B system was always somewhat vaguer and, well, was generally lesser versions of those qualifications and for local elections. So those in localities could have more of a hand in voting, even if they owned less. But for the big national elections, you needed to qualify for the A roll, and it pretty much determined national elections. And so that was the voting system they had set up. The way that blacks were represented in it, since very few blacks per capita qualified for it, was the tribal chiefs were represented in the legislature and could vote essentially as members of the legislature, which was important because pretty much all blacks, all excepting about 300,000, still lived on the tribal trust land in the villages. And because of how village life works, were just represented by their chiefs. And that was fine with them up until the very end of the war, when the terrorists had oppressed the villages and kind of tortured the villagers into supporting them. The Rhodesian government never had an issue really with tribal trust land blacks. The problem children were the 300,000 or so who had moved to the cities to work in factories or work as domestic servants or whatever, because the requirements for owning land were stricter, and they generally didn't have the right amount of property or education to be able to vote. And because they weren't on the tribal lands, they weren't represented by chiefs anymore. And so that was the flashpoint, was the outside world saying, well, you have all these blacks who can't vote and aren't represented. And the Rhodesians saying, well, our system's fair and it's just meant to exclude the incompetent. And, why should some domestic servant who makes $20 a month be able to vote the same way as a businessman who has helped develop the country? Obviously, that's just a stupid idea. which is true, but it caused the Rhodesians a lot of trouble in international relations, which is where this turned into this kind of like perpetual fight with the Rhodesians and everyone else. And there's this famous interview where Ian Smith is debating William F. Buckley on this point. And I haven't watched it in a few months, but Buckley's argument is essentially, well, wouldn't it be equality? And this is a nominal conservative pushing this, who represented, American political conservative opinion at the time, and certainly
Mhm.
was more to the right than most British conservatives, saying, well, wouldn't it represent equality if you just let the blacks vote because they're people, and that'd be good. And Smith says, well, no, you don't understand. We'll go back to the Stone Age if we give them the vote, as everywhere else in Africa has. Our system's non-racial, our system's fair. You just have to qualify whether you're white or black, and plenty of whites don't qualify because we
Mhm.
only want competent people participating in the highest levels of the political process. The formulation I always use is voting is a form of stewarding the future of the nation and its prosperity. You only should want people who can steward their own personal lives involved in that stewardship process for the nation. And if you can't, then why should you be involved? And so that was the Rhodesian argument, against mass democracy and against majority rule.
If I could just jump
Yeah.
in there for a
Yeah.
second, because I didn't know this interview existed. So was Bill Buckley pushing back hard against Ian Smith in that view? He was. Okay. So he
Mhm.
was really representing American style expansionism
Yeah.
into the West. Yeah. Interesting.
It's
If you had keep going. Yeah.
Oh, I forget what the show was called. It might have been Firing Line, but it's that classic Buckley, like, interview and debate show, and Buckley's taking the not, like, full leftist position, but the equality position.
Yeah, I mean, just the standard post-war consensus,
Yeah.
view of the 60s and 70s. Okay, so I actually like that there's two different names for these memoirs because they each emphasize something specific about the crisis. So I want to jump to the American theme first. So it's called The Great Betrayal. So what specifically was the betrayal referred to here? Rhodesia was obviously betrayed by someone, but why is that the title?
Yeah, so the big betrayal was the British betraying their colony and handing it over to the communists. Because I'm an American and tend to focus on American politics, I play up the American connection, which is
Mhm.
important, certainly. But in Ian Smith's view, Kissinger was a bad guy, but always played it pretty straight with him, somewhat ironically, where Kissinger would just explain why Rhodesia had to not, or why America couldn't be on Rhodesia's side. And Smith disagreed with that, but found the guy relatively honest and fair. At least that's how Smith portrays it in the book. In his view, it was the British who were really the dominant force in pushing Rhodesia's destruction. They were always trying to string it along with more negotiations that wasted his time, his resources, his efforts. They were always trying to aid the rebels and support the communist terrorists, as the Rhodesians called them, rhetorically, and present the pro-communism side, downplay the atrocities of the rebels, play up the supposed atrocities of the Rhodesians. He really saw it as the British had a responsibility to their former colony, and particularly the former colonists who had taken Britain at its word when it said it would protect them if they went out to try and develop this colony and build its imperial presence, build its trade networks, prosperity, all that. And so then, just because views on voting had changed over the course of 20 years, they were going to be tossed to the wolves and fed to the communists just because of this disagreement over, like, who should be allowed to vote to what degree. And he really saw that as the betrayal, the British refusing to stand by their people and their civilization in the face of pressure, and instead giving in to communism, agreeing with it, and using it as a means by which they could destroy this last real outpost of empire, or of British civilization, probably better than empire at that point.
Right. You have an essay on how the CIA knew at the time that there were facets of international communism that were basically involving themselves in the Rhodesian crisis. So, do you think it existed beyond the CIA? Do you think the American power structure actually had this communist involvement that was leading maybe the entire Allied world into betraying its outposts like Rhodesia? So this is specifically a question about the American power structure.
Yeah, the American response was largely dictated by the civil rights movement rather
Mhm.
than FDR style Reds in the government, of which I
Okay.
assume there were some, but that wasn't the dominant force. I can explain that more if you'd like.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, let's get into it.
okay. Yeah. So this was true across all administrations, including Nixon's largely, but particularly LBJ and Carter, where the CIA report I mentioned comes from 1970. And one thing it notes is that, well, the Shona, who Mugabe was a Shona, they're one of the tribes, are backed by the Chinese, the Red Chinese, and the Bele are represented by Nkomo as their terrorist leader and are backed by the Soviets. And those are the two forces. And while it's not a purely communist struggle that's going on here, there is clear communist involvement in the rebellion, and the communists are firmly on the side of those who are trying to destroy Rhodesia. However, the report goes on to note that doesn't really matter, nor does it matter that Rhodesia is prosperous and actually its economy has improved tremendously over the years, despite 10 years or 5 years at that point of pretty harsh sanctions. What matters is that Rhodesia isn't an equal society, and so it has to be destroyed on that basis. It doesn't put
Mhm.
it in quite that plainly terms, but that's essentially the content and conclusion of the CIA report that has been declassified. It, that was largely the view of the American government at the time, was though we're in this Cold War, though we're nominally fighting communism, that can be acceptable in some cases, like if we're involving ourselves in Nicaragua on behalf of a Nicaraguan government or South Korea on behalf of a South Korean government. But it's unacceptable to apply that viewpoint to Rhodesia because Rhodesia's government, its anti communist government, is largely dominated by whites who make up a minority of the country and do not believe in equality and mass democracy. And so we're going to destroy them. And that was not really explicitly stated outright until Carter, who he is from Georgia and was involved in the whole civil rights thing. His friend Andy Young was one of those civil rights hacks and was, I think, still alive actually, but he was put in charge of the UN under the Carter administration. And it was largely Andy Young who dictated American policy towards Rhodesia over the end of the Bush War and the Carter administration. And it was either his line or Carter's was the hand that picks the cotton is the hand that votes the ballot or it casts the vote, something like that. And their view essentially was because the black vote is the deciding vote and will get us elected, we need to continue representing it and representing the civil rights mindset, including as applied to international relations and our geopolitical positioning. So the communism element doesn't matter so much as the equality element, because that will help us say we're fighting for civil rights here in America. And that was a pretty widely held view. You get stories like in Brian Burroughs' Days of Rage, where one of the first terror attacks, it was either the Black Panthers or the BLA tried launching in New York, was an attack on the Rhodesian embassy, or maybe it was a consulate at the time. It was defeated by the Rhodesian Ridgebacks, scared them away, which is funny. But the American New Left, with its civil rights focused, hated Rhodesia, not so much because of the communism thing, but because of the racial angle and the equality angle.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this because the paradigm that we often get is that it was basically American style freedom, liberty, all those things against communism in this existential conflict. And yet we never step back and consider the fact that both this international liberalism, you can call it what you want, it's not really like classical liberalism, but this new liberalism, this post-war consensus, both of these things, communism and this new egalitarianism, were both at war in their own way against Western civilization.
Mhm.
Maybe interact with that a little bit because I think that also plays into the European title of the book, which is what the Great Harvest, I think it
Bitter
was,
harvest.
the Bitter Harvest. So maybe talk about that. So it wasn't purely they weren't purely motivated by communist ideology, but they had their own American style egalitarianism that was justifying their either letting this all happen to Rhodesia or maybe even facilitating it because equality meant more to them than any other standard like property rights or anything like that.
Yeah, Indochina is a great other way of looking at this because it really shows the whole thing just play out again. Though the French did do better than the British in terms of kind of standing by their people. Where if you read Background to Betrayal, similarly titled book by the John Birch Society's Hilaire de Belloc, I think, or can't remember his name right, de Barriere. He points out that the OSS throughout the 40s, including the late 40s, and up until the Korean War began, was actively supplying Ho Chi Minh with landmines, bombs, some machine guns, all that stuff, so that he could fight the French, because the OSS and then the CIA saw its purpose as being destroying the old empires as much as fighting communism, if not more so.
Right.
And so
Right.
that represented our early policy towards Indochina. That changed somewhat because we wanted to take pressure off ourselves during the Korean War. It then went back to being anti-French. Once that was over, we forced them out of Indochina and Algeria by being difficult and threatening sanctions and all that. That policy then continued, where when you look at what happened during the Vietnam War, we're told it was this years-long grinding fight against communism, where we were fighting for this like racist regime in Saigon or something, which makes no sense. If you look at what actually happened, we deposed Diem because he was virulently pro-Catholic, and we didn't want Catholics being represented in South Vietnam. Once he was gone and Catholic power was destroyed, which Catholic power was the one key pillar of anti-communist, or one of the two key pillars of anti-communist support in Vietnam. Once they were gone, we then focused the entire like CIA apparatus that wasn't involved in the Phoenix program, and certainly the entire USAID apparatus, on destroying landlords in South Vietnam, where you might think, this is insane. Why would we be fighting the communists while we destroy private property in the rice fields of Vietnam? But that's exactly what we did. We just did communist style land expropriation and distribution under the guise of equality or something. And this is well attested by mainstream histories like Max Hastings, about what we were up to. Is we just destroyed the Vietnamese landowner class in South Vietnam. And then by the time that was over, we called it Vietnamization, and left and let the country fall to the communists, because the only two groups who would have fought the communists, the Catholics and the landowners, had been destroyed. And it's weird. I mean, why would we do that? Well, because of the equality thing. We found it unacceptable that a small percentage of the country owned a large percentage of the land. We found it unacceptable that Christians would express themselves politically and fight for their rights and their interests politically, including on a nation that was, I think, primarily unbelievers. And so that's what happened in Vietnam, and that was America's Cold War strategy. It was an utter disaster. The same thing, but more so, happened in Africa, because there was also the racial angle, where America's Cold War policy, and one that we both inflicted on the Europeans, but also more or less just got them to go along with because of ideological changes within their borders, was that it can be okay for a native anti-communist group to fight the communists. Like, this is why Reagan kind of supported the anti-communist UNITA in Angola in the 80s, or why the CIA had kind of been doing so in the early 70s. It's okay for like Singham Rhee to fight the North Vietnamese, even though he doesn't really believe in equality. But it's utterly unacceptable for, say, the Portuguese to try and hold on to Mozambique, which they've had as a colony longer than America has even been settled, because it's like racist for the Portuguese to tell the Mozambicans that they can't kill each other, or it's racist for the Belgians to tell the Congolese that cannibalism isn't okay. And that was our policy, was you cannot be a white anti-communist, particularly if you're in a non-white country. And that is how American egalitarianism expressed itself during the Cold War, and how our policy as a result played out during the Cold War. And I think it makes a lot of the Cold War decision-making make much more sense, because why would we be destroying some anti-communist country in Southern Africa full of valuable minerals, and which stood as a bulwark against encroaching communist hordes, at the same time as we're spending, the modern equivalent of trillions of dollars a year on just putting tanks in Western Europe to stop the Soviets if they invade? Well, it was because of this. It was because of the egalitarianism.
Would you say it's accurate to frame the situation geopolitically as the American government was basically exporting the dynamics of the civil rights movement here in the 60s and exporting them into other countries like Africa and viewing it through that lens?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's extremely clear that that's what Carter was doing. I think in other cases, it was just not wanting to deal with the domestic blowback that would result from like protest groups seeing us as being not doing that. But certainly under Carter and during the LBJ administration, that's more or less exactly what was going on, and why that like the American racial angle made no sense in Rhodesia. It was
Right.
largely inaccurate. It didn't really apply in any way. There wasn't even the like nominal grassroots civil rights enthusiasm for race communism in Rhodesia. It was a largely outside movement engaged in by saboteurs and agitators until the late 70s. Yet the civil rights focus was put on it and then continued to be applied for that reason, and because civil rights was really the foundation of the new American Republic that rose kind of after the end of the Eisenhower administration, I guess, or during it,
Mhm.
whenever that time period is. It's yes. So to answer your question, yes.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think conservatives appreciate the role that the civil rights paradigm played in our
Mhm.
understanding of, the end of the 20th century. Like
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, we exported that model and everything, but people don't realize that the new left had, by that time, was more or less, in a general sense, abandoning its economic style Marxism,
Mhm.
its Marxist style communism. And it was pursuing this racially infused culture war stuff that was happening since the 60s here. And we
Mhm.
basically adopted that as a filter through which we pursued our geopolitical agenda.
Yeah, it's a lot like that Tom Wolfe essay book, Flack Catching or Mau Mauing the Flat Catchers. Sorry, the title always messes me up.
Mhm.
Where he describes the situation, I think in New York, with like some community leader, Black Panther, who is collecting state grants for the nominal purpose of like tamping down urban violence, and then he always uses a portion of the grants to buy more guns to then turn in to show he's doing the work, and he'll show up when he wants more funding with like a landmine he claims to have found. But it was, and the reason the whole government apparatus is working towards that end is because the ideological focus of America in the period, it entirely prevented just hanging people like that or just locking them up for good. You couldn't do it because that was seen as being racist or unequal. And so instead, you have to deal with these people and tolerate their war on civilization. And that focus was really applied to Africa in this period. And it's why books like the John Birch Society's Rhodesia Accuses are really good, because I don't really know a ton about JBS in the period, but they were not wholly focused on civil rights, but didn't let
Mhm.
that infect their thinking and descriptions of what was going on. So you get people like Peck, who wrote Rhodesia Accuses, describing the situation of the country, where he says, "Look, you say what you want about voting, but these terrorists are invading the country and then torturing primarily Black villagers to death before attacking Rhodesian families in their homes, and all they want is to steal property. These aren't good people, and we shouldn't be supporting them," which in any other era, we would have recognized. I mean, that certainly would have been a valid argument in 1910. But because of the ideological lens imposed by the civil rights movement and kind of the belief in human equality that led to it, that argument was seen as unacceptable. And you're not allowed to care what the rebels are doing so long as they're nominally doing it in the name of equality.
Right. So let's sit back to history for a moment. The independent government, the Declaration of Independence, Rhodesia style, happened in what year?
1965.
1965. Okay, so it was in 1965, and at that point, they basically built this government that could sustain the Rhodesian, political order for a number of years. And the claims were that it was going to fail because it was fully independent, and yet it was largely successful. Maybe get into its success story, because the American government and the Western, British government, they really didn't have a good argument as to why they should intervene or support the African nationalists, because the political order was relatively stable. Like they were doing a decent job in the late 60s, right?
Yeah. So there are three stages to the Bush War that kind of make this make sense. The first stage was the first 5-ish years, and it was largely a police action where you have stories of like police in their dress blues looking for the rebels. And it was the war was an issue, but largely not a big one. The next 5 years, so from like 70 to 75, the war heats up because the rebels get more guns and people, but it's largely the same thing where it's fought on the periphery, particularly the north towards Zambia, and an issue, but not that big a deal. The war then really heats up in 1975 for reasons we can get into later. And that's where it becomes the Bush War catastrophe, and the state has more trouble from that point on. But before then, so for the first 10 years of the Bush War and the first 10 years of independence, because the Bush War pretty much starts when UDI happens, the Rhodesian state just functions well. Its whole basis and the reason it wanted to continue ruling and thought it should continue ruling was that it could provide better governance than the Africans could if left to their own devices or allowed to rule.
Mhm.
And it largely continued doing that. You have Ian Smith is a good prime minister. He did have a tendency of taking the Western nations at their word repeatedly, which was a big issue because they were lying to him the whole time.
Mhm.
But that besides, he was a pretty good leader and particularly good at dealing with the Portuguese in this period. Who he quite liked Salazar and thought the Portuguese were a good ally with whom he could work. And keeping Portugal's rule in Mozambique intact for these first 10 years was a big deal that helped the Rhodesians a lot. And Smith was instrumental in making that happen. Similarly, the economy just did well. They were very good farmers. The situation they found in Rhodesia was that the land was largely just virgin. They could do whatever they wanted mechanically because there weren't, stone fences like there are in Britain where the land was all broken up. And so, yes, it is mechanized commercial farming, which a lot of the regenerative agriculture people don't like for good reasons. But they were really good at it. They grew a great tobacco. They grew wheat very well, particularly during the war years is when they became the breadbasket because they had to focus on internal consumption first, which meant food production. They're very good ranchers and were much better able to deal with things like the tsetse fly, which causes sleeping sickness, than the Africans were certainly, and even like the white Ugandans had been. And so the Rhodesian economy hums along. There are shortages of some things imposed by sanctions. Like typically you don't have a ton of variety in the grocery store. But when
Are
you
these
talk
are these British sanctions or American sanctions?
UN sanctions. So
UN
Britain
sanctions.
went to the UN, and it was the UN's first ever sanctions package, and it was also one of the few that was mandatory rather than voluntary. So the only countries that broke it at first were South Africa and Portugal. Later on, the Italians and French didn't really care and helped sell some aircraft to the Rhodesian Air Force. And then towards the end of the war, after South Africa had ditched Rhodesia and Portugal had fallen to the socialists with the Carnation Revolution, surprisingly enough, it was Israel that was really the one ally who broke the sanctions and helped the Rhodesians out by
Hmm.
selling them helicopters and guns.
Hmm.
But at the beginning, it was just Portugal, really, and as breaking the sanctions openly. And so you get things like Rory Duncan is a guy who grew up in Rhodesia, and he's a rancher in South Africa now, a great guy. His description of life in this period is that you go to the grocery store or the department store, there's not a ton of variety, but there's as much as you could buy, and it's all high quality stuff. So they had factories. They could make their own ammunition, make their own clothes. They had their own food supply. Life in Rhodesia functioned, and sanctions breaking and like African nations not really caring because they were corrupt meant that the Rhodesian economy did grow pretty substantially even after sanctions were imposed. And paired with that, you had just competent governance of the sort that has characterized non-egalitarian European rule pretty much forever, where like the roads were well built, the rail infrastructure was well maintained, the cities were nice and clean, stuff like that. Like the place functioned. And outside visitors were often taken aback because they expected to see this country under siege that was at least as bad as like New York or London of the period would be. But instead, Salisbury was far nicer. It didn't have all these issues like New York had, which is kind of funny. But anyway, to answer your question and kind of get to the end, Rhodesia was functioning quite well because its government was quite good and was still composed of this aristocracy type thing where it was really the best men of the country who were involved, particularly in like this sector of leadership, and did quite a good job. Their
Hmm.
military was probably somewhat mismanaged, or at least like a lions led by donkeys thing, but their society and economy did function well for most of the Bush War period.
All right, let's talk about the collapse of the government. So that happened in the late 70s, is that right?
Yeah, depending on where you pin it, either 78, 79, or 80. But yeah, that period.
Okay. Okay, so things started getting hot, about 5 years in, so 65 to the late 70s. Um, who was supporting this? Obviously the African nationals were being supplied somehow, being supported with resources and political dynamics. So what was going on there? Why did it get hot? And then we'll kind of gear up to the collapse.
Yeah, so for the first 10-ish years of the war, the only external base the rebels had was in Zambia, and even that was a grudging one because South Africa is to the south and was a white-run country that was on the Rhodesian side for this period. Botswana was decolonized but relatively well-run and didn't really want anything to do with this. And that's to its west. To its east was Mozambique, and that was its longest land border and also the one that bordered the ocean. And Mozambique was controlled by the Portuguese, who were resolute anti-communists and allied with Rhodesia for this period. And then to its north, you just have Zambia, and Zambia was ruled by a decolonized government. The guy was kind of insane, but not an outright communist. So he grudgingly allowed the African terrorists into the country. However, the African terrorists were split into two groups based on their ethnic identity. You have the Shona, who are led by Mugabe. Later in the war, they're primarily based out of Mozambique because more Shonas live in that part of the country, whereas the Nkomo and the Ndebele got along better in Zambia and are based out of Zambia. So at first it's both groups and they're always infighting. It's a classic like African rebels fighting each other more than the Rhodesians. And they're based out of Zambia for the first 10 years. That mattered because it's not that big of a land border. It was at least one the Rhodesians could patrol and control. And a lot of it is a body of water, a Lake Kariba, I think, and Victoria Falls, rather than a land border. So it was a lot easier to control. And so terrorism is a problem, but not that big of one. And the Soviets are backing Nkomo and his men. And the Soviet doctrine of this period for anti-colonial movements was largely like conventional large battle grand strategy, where they wanted to build up Nkomo's force to the point that he could march in and take Rhodesia, which was a disaster. That a lot of them died, and it didn't go super well. The Maoist strategy was the one pursued by Mugabe and his men, and that was backed by the Chinese and the North Koreans. It worked a lot better just because of how it functioned, but they only really had a chance to start trying it once Portugal fell to the socialists in the Carnation Revolution in 1974. The socialist government then just gave up Mozambique and didn't feel like dealing with it anymore in 1975. When it gave it up, Frelimo was the African terrorist group that took over the entire country. It had extremely close ties with Mugabe in particular and China through all that. And so at that point, communist aid, particularly to Mugabe, had this hugely increased channel because it could just be sailed into Mozambique, handed over to Frelimo. Frelimo could hand it over to Mugabe, and they could then infiltrate along this very long land border into the country and start attacking more of its agricultural operations. And that was largely how Mugabe's strategy functioned. I mean, both groups were involved in terrorism. Mugabe was much more competent than Nkomo, and also his men were much better at it. And so they would plant landmines in the roadways, so it made travel very difficult, particularly for civilians who didn't have armored vehicles. They would ambush cars on the roadways, which did the same thing, which is why you see pictures of these Rhodesian cars, and they'll have like 8 shotgun barrels strapped to the roof with a lanyard they could yank to just clean the area and buckshot, which actually worked pretty well. Or that you have them attacking the tribal trust lands to try and force the blacks to aid the terrorists instead of the Rhodesian security forces. Or you have the rebels attacking the Rhodesian farms. That took various forms. Sometimes they would just attack the farmhouses and try and attack it with mortars or rifles. Sometimes they would just burn the crops or like cut the legs off the cattle, which was particularly rough. And use that as the means by which they could wage economic war against the Rhodesian state and encourage the demographic outflows of whites, both of which strategies eventually did prove pretty effective in forcing Rhodesia to surrender, because starting in 75, the white population started shrinking, which was a big deal in that not only did that mean there were fewer whites to recruit from, but one of their things was they wouldn't allow the black portion of the armed forces to outnumber the white portion of the armed forces. So as they had fewer whites from whom they could draw, they also could recruit fewer Africans just to keep it even, which was a big problem. They ran out of manpower, and also their economy suffered tremendously. So that continues for a few years. It gets pretty bad starting in 1977 is when the war like really, really explodes. And then in 78 and 79, the rebels start having more successes. For example, they destroy about a quarter of the country's oil supply, an attack on the oil depot around Salisbury, which is now Harare.
Who's supporting
Similarly,
the rebels? Is this American support? Is this Chinese support?
primarily Chinese for these rebels because they're primarily Mugabe's men. Nkomo and his forces, who are Soviet backed, are still involved. They're just less effective, essentially. America and Britain are involved in this in two ways. One is in 75, Kissinger presses the South Africans to stop supplying the Rhodesians, which was a big deal. So the South Africans withdraw military police units that had been patrolling some of the less dangerous portions of the border. They stopped sending as many weapons to South Africa. They stopped backing it and geopolitics. And the impetus for that was Operation Eland, which is this famous Rhodesian attack on a terrorist compound in Zambia. It's the one where it's like one guy wounded, 3,000 rebels killed. It's the one that goes around where you see the Wikipedia casualty stats. It was a tactically successful operation, but it did reignite the war in the public eye, which was a big problem, and eventually led to the South Africans, who were led by an appeasement guy at the time, halting aid for Wild Rhodesia, which was a big problem. And that was primarily America's doing and America's involvement. Britain was forcing Smith to negotiate constantly and really wearing him down, and while also enforcing the blockade and enforcing the sanctions. And that was Britain's primary involvement. So neither gave much military aid to the rebels, though there are allegations that both MI6 and the CIA, primarily MI6, supplied the rebels with information they got from a couple traders within the Rhodesian apparatus, such as Ken Flower, who was in charge of Rhodesian intelligence and probably a traitor, though that's not proven. And so that was Western involvement was primarily rhetorical, sanctions, intelligence, and pressure on the South Africans. And after the oil supply is blown up, that's a big problem for Rhodesia because they can't really replace it very well, and it causes huge issues for agriculture and the military. They're also running out of air equipment, which is a problem because it's a huge country. It's about the size of Texas, and there just weren't that many people, and it has a huge land border. So they tried to improvise, like with the Gray Scouts, who are those men on horseback that make the really cool pictures. Similarly, you have the Fire Force missions, which is where they would either with targeters out in the field or with scout aircraft find places they thought the rebels were and then paratroop in at about treetop level to attack them, sometimes doing that the same unit like 6 times a day. So it really wore the men down and wore the air equipment down because it's coming in so low. But that's how the war went. I know that's kind of rambling. Those are the tactics. It reached a head in 1979 because the Rhodesians just ran out of men. The demographic problem was particularly exacerbated by Nkomo shooting down 2 civilian airliners over the late 1978, early 1979 period. And those were pretty grisly incidents. They not only shot down the aircraft, but then raped and bayoneted the survivors, including a pregnant woman. Mugabe then admitted to it and said he did it and was laughing about it on the BBC. And I think, it was on the BBC that he was laughing about it. The British state didn't care. Carter vocally took Nkomo's side, as did Andy Young after the incident, saying it was fine and, he wouldn't harm a fly. He didn't do nothing. As he was just massacring civilians. And so a lot of whites left after the hack because they didn't think the war was winnable and they didn't want that to happen to them. It was hard to take money out of the country, so they really just left with like some furniture, if anything. And that's kind of how the war reached its military conclusion, was just this fizzle as the Rhodesians won on the battlefield but lost strategically because they were attrited down to nothing.
Yeah, I mean it's a really tragic story. It's sad, and I think the saddest part is like, we have this romantic understanding of American involvement in the post-war world, but really that there's things that we need to take into account as we understand our own history here. So Mugabe comes out on top of all of this, and he represents Chinese interests. Maybe you could say, what did the Americans even get out of this? I mean, one of the questions was, after he takes total power of Zimbabwe, there's an economic collapse. The farms are seized. Their productivity is destroyed. The entire society breaks down. What did we get out of that? What did we earn? And one of the things that you said in your essays and elsewhere is that Ian Smith continued to say, "I told you so. I was right. I was vindicated," and yet the entire Western world didn't care.
Yeah, we got nothing out of it. We essentially just stopped being involved after Mugabe took over, which was particularly horrendous because this moderate named Bishop Abel Murzera, I think is how you say his name, was made president in like 78, 79, and he worked with the whites and probably would have been fine, and was elected in what all accounts said was a fair mass democratic election. The British and Mugabe in Nkomo said that was unfair because it was racist or something, and so they had to redo the election in 1980, which is when Mugabe takes over because he just sends his terrorist army in to terrorize everyone into voting for him, which then sets him up as having complete political power. America leaves at that point. We're kind of uninvolved, other than Carter and Andy Young both love Mugabe and talk about him for years afterwards. Yeah, I hate Carter. Then the British stay more involved. They certify the election and back Mugabe, but then try to keep things from going out of control by creating this law and constitutional protection around the expropriation of land, where they say so long as the land, when taken from white farmers to be given to blacks, is taken as part of a legal process and fair compensation is paid, the British will reimburse the Zimbabweans, or essentially pay for the land expropriation, and continue subsidizing the state as part of the Commonwealth. That means things were, for whites, basically okay, so long as you weren't a political dissident for about 15-ish years into the mid-90s. Over this period, Mugabe solidifies his control by engaging in the Grukundi, which is where he genocides the Ndebele. The Ndebele and Shona hated each other, and no one cares. It was like he brought in North Koreans to help him do it. It was well known that it happened at the time. Both America and Britain just shrugged it off, didn't really care, nor did they care that he became a dictator. But then in the 90s, Mugabe's veterans were upset because during the war he had promised them land and farms, and they never got those because he was just a kleptocrat. And this is true. He wanted to preserve good relations with the British, not because they were subsidizing his state, but because that was the only way he could continue to buy Rolls Royces and suits from Henry Poole, which is the famous Savile Row tailor. And so he kept the he kept the expropriations low so he could buy the suits he liked, which it checks out. But then his men were getting very uppity by the 90s. So first he looted the treasury and just gave them a cash bonus. As one could expect, they quickly spent the reparations like immediately, and all that money was gone. So then they still wanted their farms, but the state was broke and couldn't pay for expropriation anymore. And similarly, the British, I think David Cameron was in charge at this period, but I can't remember. In any case, the British were tired of dealing with it and said they weren't going to subsidize Mugabe anymore. So he just started taking over white land. He got like a Zimbabwean Supreme Court ruling saying it was okay, but really just he allowed his men to go in his squatters and take over white-owned farms, which is where those pictures of expropriation come from. And that started in the 90s, really was a big deal for the first decade-ish of the 2000s. And then by 2013, there wasn't a white-owned farm left in the country. America got nothing out of this, as you're asking about. People claim that it was like so that like an American mining company or that British mining company, BHP, could get like contracts to mine cobalt in Zimbabwe, which is just untrue. They would have worked with Ian Smith to do that if they wanted to. We got nothing. It was a total disaster. The hyperinflation wiped out Zimbabwean society. At some points, the inflation was so high that the government couldn't even afford to print money anymore because the German printer who was printing it couldn't print it fast enough to pay for its printing. And all the white-owned farms going away meant the economy collapsed because all of the country's labor force pretty much was reliant on agriculture. And so the country collapsed. It was a total disaster. Mugabe ended up dying, and then his wife was deposed a few years later.
What happened to Ian Smith? Where did he go? Did he flee?
No, he stayed and tried to work with Mugabe, and tried to put a leash on some of Mugabe's worst impulses. At first, Mugabe kind of pretended to work with him and listen to him and do that whole thing. Then, as Mugabe solidified power and grew emboldened, he stopped doing that. First, there was a like general gun confiscation where they just collected all the guns in the country, which were registered because it was a Commonwealth country. And so, like Ian Smith writes about losing his farm rifle that he used to shoot varmints and predators and that sort of thing. They take all the war guns away from the white population. Then a few years later, they confiscated Smith's farm, which has been in his family since they arrived as settlers. And Smith fled to his house in the city, which, for whatever reason, white-owned property in the cities like Harare or Salisbury or Bulawayo was never really confiscated in the same way, nor was crime of the sort one might imagine, like as a South African, ever quite as big an issue. So Smith moved to the city and lived there and occasionally did interviews.
Mhm.
But he was not taken seriously by Mugabe after the first couple years and had all his property stolen. One thing that did change the situation in Zimbabwe somewhat is that because the white government had ruled so well and done such a good job and been pretty fair to the natives, you didn't get quite the same situation you got in like the Congo or you get in South Africa now, where there's this extreme racial hostility in most interactions between whites and blacks. You did have Mugabe's men taking over the farms, and some people died, which was terrible. But there wasn't a genocide, and generally the whites just left rather than being killed. And you didn't get like the farm murders generally. There are a couple cases where that did happen to famous political figures, kind of like Ian Smith's second in command. But it wasn't quite the same thing because the Rhodesians had been different and managed the country a lot better.
Where did these whites go? Did they go to the United States or Europe or?
New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. Some went to Canada or Britain or America, but
Yeah.
primarily South
Interesting.
Africa and Oceania.
Looking at today's world, so we're facing all sorts of economic pressures, immigration issues. We're still having debates about hierarchy and egalitarianism. What lessons do you think from Rhodesia's experience and even the West's role in the downfall of Rhodesia? What do you think what's most relevant about that we can kind of take home and think about the chaos around us?
Yeah, I'll start with immigration. There are two ways in which that matters. One is that though Zimbabwe never had like a big illegal immigration thing, they did have the black population grow rapidly and really start to outnumber the whites in a way that was hard to deal with by the time the Bush War started. And so it's important to remember that like the reason that stopping mass migration matters is because once you're outnumbered, particularly to a certain degree, that's just a losing game, and it's really hard to deal with that. The other thing is there's this interesting split in Rhodesian society where up until like the early 50s, they were very selective in their immigration criteria for whites. And the people who came in under that system, even if they kept a British passport or something like that, they were better, so the data seems to show, about staying and fighting to the end because they saw themselves as Rhodesians and were fully part of that. But then there were a lot of economic immigrants, including ones who weren't even from Britain, who came in kind of after the mid 50s because the Rhodesians wanted to boost their white numbers by loosening up the immigration restrictions somewhat. And those people left pretty quickly. Don Shift wrote a good book about lessons from the Bush War where he talks about this in some depth. There are other books that point to it as well. It does seem to have been a thing where the people who saw themselves as being there for economic gain did not really see themselves as Rhodesians and just up and left once the going became difficult. And that's really what cost Rhodesia the war. So it's important to remember that a lot of people, whether they're white or not, if they're here for economic benefit, they're not going to be helpful when the chips are down, and you can't rely on them before then. And then the big mistake Smith made during the war, and one that he's routinely noted as being deficient in this respect, despite his, exemplary conduct and strong moral virtue and everything. He took the West at its word, which is insane. He really seems to have believed the Victorian ideals that formed Rhodesia were still alive in some respect, and that by simply showing the West the right data about like how blacks' lives were better off in Rhodesia, which they were, it had the highest standard of living and literacy rate for blacks on the entire continent, that
Mhm.
that would matter. And it never did, and it was just wasted breath and wasted effort. We're focusing on, seizing the port at Beira to be able to import oil, or rebuilding, relations with South Africa, or going along with them in federation with them despite not really liking apartheid. Probably would have been more effective. And so you were asking about realism earlier. I think that's the big lesson on that front, is that when people hate you, you can't negotiate with them or reason with them. Either they will be
Mhm.
destroyed or you will be. And it's important that every action you take be premised on that understanding. Doesn't mean do anything imprudent or be like an insane person who's, unpleasant to deal with, particularly with your friends. But you do need to keep that in mind, and it's very important. And Smith never really seems to have gotten that, at least until the end. The other last big lesson is from South Africa's perspective, where they betrayed the Rhodesians in 1975, which was another part of the Great Betrayal, because
Mhm.
they thought that if they appeased the African nationalists and showed like goodwill and a willingness to work with these people, then it wasn't just that the lion would eat them last, but that the lion might not eat them at all because it would be satiated by Rhodesia, which was insane. You're dealing with communists who just want to kill you and take your stuff. You're not dealing with rational people or people who can be negotiated with. But it's what the South Africans believed, and it cost them their country. Had they
Mm.
kept Rhodesia and the resources in it, I, the sanctions that destroyed apartheid wouldn't really have mattered to them. They would have controlled hugely valuable cobalt resources, probably copper resources, farmland. It wouldn't have mattered, but because they destroyed Rhodesia and participated in the destruction of it, they lost their country and are now dying in these awful farm attacks. So the lion ate them last. They were the last man standing, but they were eaten nonetheless, which I think is another lesson the right could learn.
Yeah, I mean, what you said about Ian Smith, it's really, conservatives at least seem to understand the stakes, and yet they still believe in things that may be outdated now. And I think
Mhm.
that's kind of what you're hitting at
Yeah.
with Ian Smith, is these Victorian ideals. Some of the great achievements and heroic political actions of the 19th century no longer existed in the 1970s, and especially in Britain, where he thought they were thriving. And that world is behind us now, and we need to act in light of what we have, the enemies that we face, the
Mhm.
tools that we have available to us. And it's really hard, I think, for conservatives, ideological conservatives, maybe post-war consensus conservatives, to be realists. And I think that's one thing that maybe us younger right wingers have adopted and ingested more than those that came before us. So let me just end this with a simple question that guests usually hate, but I prepped you for it. If you could give us several book recommendations to learn more about Rhodesia, where would you go?
Yeah, first, Ian Smith's The Great Betrayal or Bitter Harvest. It's kind of hard to find and can be expensive if you choose it the wrong part of the cycle. But when you see a copy pop up for like $70, it's worth ordering. And it's quite good and informative. For war memoirs, there are a ton of them. Some of them are good, some of them aren't. My favorite by far is Three Sips of Gin by Tim Bax. He was a Celis scout during the war. They were a cool special operations unit. It is, I think, far and away the best war memoir. He's a very good writer. It's actually a good book rather than just exciting. I really didn't like Fire Force, which is the one you see recommended the most. I don't think Cox was a great writer, and his book is somewhat depressing, needlessly so. We Dared to Win, which is about the Rhodesian SAS, is kind of a middle
Mhm.
ground where it's not as good as Three Sips of Gin, but it is a lot better than Fire Force. So if you're looking at war memoirs, start with Three Sips of Gin. For a general history, this is another problem. There's not a good general history of Rhodesia. Peter Baxter's A Complete History probably comes the closest, but it's not great because it focuses on like the diplomatic negotiations and the political situation rather than the economic or cultural stuff. And really, it's the economy and culture that make Rhodesia so interesting because it's a lot like Virginia but cooler, and or in many ways cooler. So Baxter is kind of so-so. There's one called A Pride of Eagles, which is about the Rhodesian Air Force nominally, but it ends up just being like a complete history of the country and a complete history of the Bush War. And it's a quite good overview of both. So even though it's nominally about the Air Force, if you're looking for like general history of the country and the war, it's probably the best. And then finally, the lessons from the Bush War by Don Shift that I mentioned earlier it's kind of vaguely like prepper coded and prepper focused in terms of like tactical stuff from Rhodesia, but there's a lot of really good political lessons in it and lessons about why the Rhodesians lost that make it quite good and valuable. So just to review, The Great Betrayal by Ian Smith, Three Sips of Gin by Tim Bax, A Pride of Eagles, and Lessons from the Rhodesian Bush War.
Yeah, I did find The Great Betrayal. I think it's over $1,000 on Amazon or something, but I do have a PDF that I found too. So maybe I'll upload that somewhere where people can find it. But in any case, Will, where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on X at Will_Tanner_1. You can find me at Substack at theamericantribune.news, and you can find me on YouTube at The Old World Show.
Appreciate you coming on today. It's a good topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Everyone else, please like and subscribe and share this conversation. There are many more to come every Wednesday. Thank you and have a great week.